You know, it's interesting. I think about this, and it's like living a lie.
Hi, I'm Alex Gibney. I'm the director of the film. This interview with Lance Armstrong is really interesting because I shot it just 2 or 3 hours after the Oprah interview taping. And I've never seen Lance look like this physically. I mean, you can see his body language, which doesn't have that sort of sense of purpose and power that he normally does. And we shot it in his house in Austin, not using any artificial light. It has that kind of late afternoon vibe, which seems to match the late afternoon vibe of his career. But I think his manner in this interview is really interesting because it's so subdued. I think the Oprah interview took a lot out of him, and it was interesting to get into it with him right after that because I got something out of it I think that Oprah didn't get. Now we're flashing back. This is Lance going down to the Tour de France back in 2009. I was tasked originally to make this film with the idea of following him during his 2009 return from retirement to cycling. We had extraordinary access to Lance, so we would often ride with him in the car. At the same time, at the tour, it was a really exciting moment for me as a filmmaker because we had so many resources. We had 10 cameras at the tour, and we were able to cover it from a lot of different angles. The interesting thing about this film, and one of the reasons that it's a departure for me, is that I actually put myself in the film as a character. And that became vital because it was the only way to understand really how the whole thing worked. I had been fooled. I was the one who had been lied to by Armstrong in 2009. And in order to go back and understand that footage and to be able to reckon with it in terms of new interviews and all the revelations about doping, I had to be a character because it meant that we could understand it all through my eyes. This piece of the footage is left over from the original film. This is exactly what the original film was like.
But in that, you either win or you lose.
And we saw no reason to change it. You're about to see, I mean, this is obviously footage of Lance after his recovery from cancer. And this interview and the way it's shot, looking straight into the camera, is one that I designed for the entire 2009 experience. So every time you see this image, it means it's a 2009 interview. One of the important things about the title sequence was that we felt we needed to give people who didn't know that much about Lance Armstrong some sense of understanding of the power of his career. And so we stitched together a main title sequence that both showed us the main titles, but also showed the highs and lows of his career. And we interspersed it with all sorts of voices, not only talking about how great he was, but in some cases, how ruthless he was. And in some cases, what a cheat he was. So you get some sense of the enormous controversy throughout his life. One of the most amazing things that cyclists think about on this particular moment is that he's actually pedaling there through the field, which takes a lot of guts because that's the way you take control of the bike, but very few people probably would have thought of that. And nobody knew, that you could actually pedal across that field and do it. So this gives you some sense of what a dramatic character he was throughout his career.
About Armstrong, he has the acceleration when he wants to climb. He could do it. He has now decided, I want to go.
This is one of the most famous moments of the tour when a musette caught his bike and pulled him down. He then popped back up and then got right back in the hunt and then kicked it into gear and took the lead. You can see him wearing the yellow jersey, which of course is the jersey that the person wears who's actually winning the race of the Tour de France. It's called the maillot jaune.
Professional sportsmen. There will be guys who cheat and there will be guys who don't cheat. This is a guy who is going to succeed no matter what.
His comeback and storybook life have put Lance Armstrong under...
The producers of this film are Frank Marshall and Matt Tolmach. Frank Marshall is a legendary producer, has produced many of Steven Spielberg's films. And Matt Tolmach was an executive at Sony when when they reached out to me, they had been developing a film about Lance Armstrong for a long time, and a fiction film that was going to be starring Matt Damon. But they couldn't get to a point where they really liked the script enough to make it. And so when Lance decided to come back, they decided to make a documentary, and they reached out to me to see whether I'd be interested. And initially the film was all about the 2009 year, that comeback year before we all knew for sure that Lance had doped. This was key because we were able to get permission to film behind the scenes at the famous Oprah interview with Lance, which was a tremendous turning point in this story. Because, you know, for the first time, he was coming clean. Up till this point, he had denied everything, even though people like Floyd and others had come forward and really detailed some of what was going on. But still, Lance, his approach was always to deny and to attack. And by doing that, somehow, mysteriously, he was able to emerge unscathed. As, you know, these accusations didn't touch him. But over time, this plus the specter of a criminal investigation really did break down the lie, the Armstrong lie.
Tour de France titles. Lance Armstrong has no place in cycling.
This scene is actually in the green room where I was sitting with a bunch of Lance's lawyers, agents, advisors, and they were all watching this performance because Lance had never come clean before. So everybody was nervous about how he was going to perform. And I would say this was a real performance. Lance thought he was going to win back all his fans, I think, by coming clean. But the view was that it was too much of a performance, that the cyclist felt he didn't divulge enough, and I think that the public at large felt that it was almost too brutally shocking from what they had believed, because they had believed he was clean. You know, so he seemed to be hiding something. So the performance didn't go as well as he had planned. In the past, he had been such a magnificent performer.
The first few minutes of Oprah was just riveting to finally witness him saying that he doped.
Bill Strickland's an interesting character because he wrote a book called The Tour de Lance, and the Tour de Lance is Bill's experience during the 2009 Tour de France. And he followed Lance throughout that. He also co-wrote the biography of Lance's longtime coach, Johan Brunel. But Bill always had a very much of an insider's perspective. And what was interesting about Bill was that after a very long period of time of being a true believer, he announced at one time that he now believed that Lance had doped, and Lance, you know, railed on him and cut off contact with him. But then over time, prior to coming forward on Oprah, he began to start to talk to Bill about how he would have his secret told. And so Bill became a very intriguing character for me because he had been on kind of the same journey that I had been on. This was footage that, you know, while we were waiting to go back into the film, we stopped the film entirely at a certain point. We had finished the original film, 2009, and then we had to put a stop to it when all this stuff happened. But along the way, I would film things occasionally on my own, and that was one of those things. I'd heard they were burning Lance Armstrong in effigy, so I had a crew in England go get it. But it was a very unusual experience to actually finish a film and then know that we were going to have to put it on the shelf and wait until events played themselves out and then go back in. What we didn't know at the time was that I was going to go back into all that footage from the 2009 tour and see it with a new set of eyes. This now flashes back. This is all from 2009, and this was, I believe, one of the very first days I shot. This is in Austin, and we were shooting from a van and just trying to actually conduct an interview while Lance was riding, which was challenging, but seemed to kind of capture. He was so comfortable on his bike.
I was really surprised. I remember I sent him a message back and I said,
you know, when I first went to Lance, it was an intriguing moment because I had to confess to him that basically I knew he rode a bike, I knew he was good at it, and that was about it. You know, I had some sense of the allegations and controversy about doping, but I really didn't have any understanding of cycling itself and how it worked. This gives some sense of setup of the key 2009 interview. We had a backdrop that we used and a device that I called a Tonytron, which is a mechanism that fits over the camera with a 45-degree angle of prompter glass. So I sit at 90 degrees to the camera, blocked off from Lance with a screen, and then Lance looks into the barrel of the lens and sees me actually off the reflection sitting off to the side. And that way Lance looks directly into the camera, which I find, particularly for those interviews in 2009, to have been very effective. And it was powerful for Lance. You can see that gaze and how difficult it is to resist it, because he lied a lot during those interviews, but they're very compelling. It was in jeopardy.
The story is refused
The tour doesn't want it.
entry into the Tour de France.
This next scene is fascinating because this is basically Lance's key group of advisors. There's Bill Stapleton, his agent, Johan Brunel, his longtime coach, Mark Higgins, his PR guy, and Lance. And they're all talking about, whether or not the tour is going to let him back in. But what's so interesting about this conversation is they're all remarking on the fact that he's never been busted. They don't ever say that he's never doped. They just say he's never been busted. And so it's very much of a kind of conversation in code. They've all accepted the fact that Lance has gotten away with it. And so in this conversation, they're, play acting this fantastic fiction, which they now have come to believe. The mensonge Armstrong is the Armstrong Lie. This was the first article that really laid out Armstrong's lie. Came out in 2005. The lie itself, I think, is really the heart of the story here. Somebody says later, it's not a story about doping. It's a story about power, and it's a story about a lie, a grand fiction.
Arguably, a death sentence. Why would I then enter into a sport and dope myself up and risk my life again? That's crazy. I would never do that. That's no.
We think about the lie, and we think that, gee, okay, he had to lie because he had to cover up his doping. I think with Lance, he made the lie so huge, so elaborate, and embroiled so many people in it, particularly cancer survivors, millions of them all over the world, that's what really, at the end of the day, offended people far more than the idea that he had doped, because so many other people had doped.
Shortly after Armstrong retired, there was
In terms of reckoning with that, we felt we had to reckon with that argument. And one of the things that, I did when we were making the film was to go back and look at all the people who had shared the podium with Lance, the second and third place riders in the years that he had won the tour. And we realized, oh my God, all of them except one, the one guy who's kept in focus there, were busted for doping. And that meant that that the chances that Lance hadn't doped were pretty improbable. That was something I really figured out at the time. So even when I was making the first film, I had a sense that what Lance had done in the past, that he had likely doped. Now, this next interview subject, Dan Coyle, is an interesting character. He wrote two very important books. One was called Lance Armstrong's War, and the other was The Secret Race that he co-wrote with Tyler Hamilton, who was one of Lance's key teammates who ultimately came forward with a lot of detail. This photograph was one that we took on set. And, late in the editing process of this second film, we realized that there was a key part missing, which was that we needed to address the fact of how I had been betrayed, how angry I was, and how I demanded that Lance give me another chance at interviewing him, and this time he was going to be more truthful. And that way we set up this new interview, which is shot intentionally very differently from the old interview, so that we would have a sense of process. One of the virtues of putting myself in the film is that we could jump back and forth in time, but one of the key structural challenges in putting this film together was to figure out just how to place this interview to give it a sense of specialness, and it had to come out of that sense of betrayal, the idea that I was pissed off, that he had lied to me so often in 2009, and I demanded another opportunity to talk through what had happened. I think this interview, in many ways, is quite honest. Sometimes, though, Lance says things that we don't necessarily want to hear about him. We sort of expect him to to give us another beautiful story like the story he had given us before. But the truth about Lance is he's a hard character, and he was quite brutal, and he saw things sometimes in a very binary way. Win, lose, live, die. That's a pretty dark philosophy if you really think about it. So that interview, I think, captures something essential about Lance. Not this character. This is the character, the kind of promo character, but a tougher character, the athlete, the one who will do anything to win.
Beginning in Australia, ending in France, it is the best way to promote this.
Now, in the original film, we had spent a lot more time going through the whole 2009 year. When we came back to it, a lot of that had to be curtailed and shortened. This was a key section, though, that we kept. This was from the original film. You have to understand the lie, you have to understand Lance's myth. And Lance wouldn't have been Lance without the cancer myth. And the cancer myth comes out of a certain truth, which was that he almost died from cancer. He had lesions on his brain. So it's really unfair to tell the Lance story without reciting this aspect of it, because this is what gives him his power. This is, hope rides again would be one of the slogans that came out of, the Lance Armstrong promo machine. Because the idea that you could come back from cancer, that you could not only survive but be better than you were, that was an extraordinary idea, and it made him a mythic figure, somebody way more important, way more famous than a cyclist, and particularly in the United States, where cycling is a rather niche sport. But the whole cancer idea, this is life and death, win, lose, live, die. Now, there's 3 photos that are going to come up soon. They're black and white photos. They're just about to pop in. They were taken by a cycling photojournalist named James Start, who had, an intriguing perch on the Armstrong story and ultimately became part of a group of people who started telling bits and pieces of the truth. But those photographs, I think, capture a kind of power in Lance and the emerging power of the cancer survivor who is going to come back and be reborn into something extraordinary. This is a piece of the interview from the original film that I really found very poignant, which was just talking about himself as a kid and the freedom that one gets on a bicycle. No matter what you think about Lance did in his lie, there's something so elemental about what he did, and he's capturing that here, this notion of a kid on his bike, which I always loved and found it very powerful.
Backyard, they get on the bike, they go down, they take a right, take a left, nobody sees them, they're completely free.
We had hundreds of hours of footage for this film. In the 2009 tour, we had to, we had 10 cameras following the tour, so it was just an extraordinary amount of material that we had to sift through. It took us over a year and a half to cut the first film just because we were drowning in so much material. Not to mention the fact that we had an extraordinary amount of archival material to get through. And particularly for Lance, we went looking for clues to who he was as an essential person. This is a kid who grew up angry because, his dad left when he was very, very young. He calls him the sperm donor. But there was, we found some of these early clips which were so great because they talk about, I love beating people is what he says. And there's something elemental about that was so powerful. And you can see Lance, he's this is the Lance that's the brash young kid long prior to becoming the elder statesman of cycling. This is the guy, pumping his fist, who was unsanded. He was tough, he was brash, he didn't have any of the sophistication that he would later get. That's one of the most remarkable things I think about Lance, is how much sophistication ultimately he would assume. He lost that kind of brash, out front demeanor and became this kind of grand politician.
94, 95, I was a young kid, one of the best one-day racers in the world.
I should say a little something about the editorial team on this film. We started out with 2 editors, Tim Squires, who has edited a lot of Ang Lee's films, and Lindy Yankura, who is a tremendous member of the Jigsaw team. She's worked on a number of films, including Gonzo and the Jack Abramoff film. they had to go through an extraordinary amount of footage in order to be able to cull it down to what we were ultimately able to use in the first film, the film which is also about 2 hours long. It's much more about cycling, really. But they just did an extraordinary job. And then it was Andy Grieve who came in and cut the second film, preserving a lot of the first, but integrating a much more complicated and intricate structure than the first film, by necessity.
What a comeback this could be. There's only 2 men behind him now.
And this footage comes from 1999, the Tour de France. We decided to spend a lot of time in 1999 because that was kind of the key year when Lance, as Dan Coyle says, cracks the code. And we found a lot of wonderful archival footage. In part, this is stuff that we got from Betsy Andreu. I believe it was also shot by Kevin Livingston, and some of this material is also shot by Betsy. But it really creates this sense of these, look, innocent kids, basically kids, who are going to France and trying to make something happen. So to understand what would ultimately become this grand conspiracy, this ability to hide this enormous doping program, you have to understand where it starts, which are these young kids who are just going to Europe trying to make their way in what had been, a very European sport, and frankly, a rather cynical sport. There was a kind of a macho element to cycling that was really all about doping. I mean, part of the macho-ness of the sport was how much dope can you do in order to get to where you need to go. And it's not surprising in a way that doping would be so much of a part of the Tour de France because, frankly, it's a brutal sport. I mean, it's a sport. One of the things we lost from the first film was a little detail which has to do with how many calories you burn on a day, particularly on a mountain stage. On a mountain stage, riding full bore, in order to replace the calories that you lose, you'd have to eat the equivalent of 27 cheeseburgers. I always thought that was a kind of a fantastic idea. The idea that you could eat 27 cheeseburgers and then get on your bike and burn it all off. The fact is that cyclists have to ride and eat almost nonstop. There are a few parts of the stages like this where obviously you're sprinting, but they're eating constantly because they burn so much energy. It's just staggering. The George Hincapie interview is interesting. I interviewed George for the 2009 film, but for obvious reasons, he had very little to say. He was almost purposefully boring.
That was unprecedented.
And because he didn't want to give anything away. He was the key guy, who when he testified against Lance, everything turned from a public perception perspective because he was well known as a kind of grand ambassador, well liked throughout the peloton, throughout cycling. And when he turned and gave testimony against Lance, everything turned for Lance. So coming back to George and then getting a different character who is now willing to say exactly what had happened before, that was a kind of an odd experience, I have to say, because I had sat with him before, I had done an interview before, I had asked questions before, but there was a whole different vibe now. It was like, okay, that was then, this is now, I can tell you the truth. Now, this whole section on the Festina affair was a piece that was terribly important, even in the earlier film. One thing I should say, and even this interview with David Walsh was conducted for the earlier film. So the first film wasn't utterly naive about doping. We knew it was a part of the story, but the problem was doping was a story that was hiding in plain sight. You couldn't definitively say that Lance had doped because he had never tested positive, and he had never admitted. In fact, he had baldly denied that he'd ever doped. But there was a lot of smoke. There was no fire yet, but there was a lot of smoke. And so the first film had included a lot of this material in terms of the past, because the first film was called The Road Back. And the road back, of course, referred to the comeback, but it also referred to the road back to the past, the idea that by coming back, it was going to lead to all these questions that had originally been raised about Lance's doping. And so that first film had to reckon with that. That's why the structure, ultimately, of the second film, as we called it, the final film, The Armstrong Lie, was very complicated because we had to move back and forth in time and place so often in order to begin to put the details together of what was essentially a mystery story. And the mystery was not whether Lance doped, because we knew that now. The mystery was how. And then the other mystery was, like those great thrillers when the bank robber goes back to try to rob the bank again. It's like, why would you go back? Why did he come back in 2009? It was the mystery that sort of haunted the film. Now, Reed Albergotti has written a book called Wheelmen, along with his co-author, and it looks more at the business of cycling. And one of the things that you have to understand about Armstrong, and we try to be more explicit about in this film, was the context of his power. Because of the power of his story, he made cycling tremendously financially viable. People would show up who didn't care at all about cycling because they cared about Lance Armstrong. That was particularly true in the United States. And so his economic power gave him, with either a wink and a nod or by intention, the willingness of the governing body of cycling and also sponsors to sort of enable what he was doing. They certainly were willfully blind to what he was doing, if not more than that, because he was so successful. Nobody wanted to rain on that parade. That was just a fact. I think that's one of the great lessons of this film, is how a lie that was so well known to be a lie, so many people knew that Lance was doping, so many critics had made so much public, and yet Lance, through the force of his personality and with the complicity of so many people who were financially profiting from him, managed to make those accusations just go away.
But they want to do it to clarify this situation and stop it.
Here is a piece of footage that we found that was really quite extraordinary, because already you can see that people are kind of cheerleading for Lance and trying to pretend that nothing's going on. Surely this cancer survivor couldn't be doping. And so by finding bits and pieces of footage like that and then sticking them together with Lance's rather candid admission about how they covered up tests, in this case, got a backdated prescription for a cream, which was fictitious. There was no cream. There was only the drug that Lance had used prior to the tour in order to help him with his recovery. But, you can, looking back, when you're looking for bits and pieces of the mystery, looking back into the footage and into photographs like this one, you can see the texture and the detail of what was going on. That was what was wonderful about the second film, was going back and seeing all sorts of footage in a completely new light. Now, this footage, we had to include, and this was also in the original film, because we wanted to give some context to the overall need to dope. And the context really is suffering. I mean, it's a brutal sport because of what you have to do. This wonderful color footage, I should say, comes from a beautiful short film on the Tour de France called Le Tour by Louis Malle, the great French filmmaker. And it's just exquisite footage. This is what you get from great filmmakers, where they're not photographing a record, they're photographing details that are so telling. I mean, look at how gaunt those faces are, how much they're sweating, how much pain they're in. Everything else is just going by in the distance. And then we found this other piece of footage in the Louis Malle bit, which is about to come up in just a second. This stuff, where, the idea that riders would go into a cafe and pull out baguettes and beer and wine and then get back on their bikes is just staggering. But and of course, it does them no good at all in terms of performance-enhancing drugs, but it did dull the pain, which was one of the most important things about it.
And that became apparent in the...
Now, the next section of the film is terribly important because it has to do with Lance's secret weapon, Dr. Michele Ferrari. And in 2009, I knew all about Dr. Ferrari, and he was a notorious figure, but almost nobody had interviewed him. I was only able to find one interview with him. But then I thought, well, I'll ask Lance, maybe he'll give me permission to talk to Ferrari, because Ferrari, we had approached him and he wouldn't agree to do it unless Lance gave permission. Miraculously, he did. I think the reason he did was because he felt that he was going to be totally open in this 2009 tour. And so he's like, go ahead, look under the bed, look in the cupboards, wherever you want. You're not going to find doping. And talk to Dr. Ferrari. You know, he's not going to tell you anything. There was this sense of hubris about the whole enterprise that I found rather amazing. Now, having said that, I was so thrilled and so excited about going to talk to Dr. Ferrari, this notorious Ferrari, who, from all accounts, was, this incredibly dark, sort of snidely whiplash figure. And yet when I got to meet him, he was so charming, so sort of affable, and so terribly smart. That's one of the great things about documentary. I mean, if I'd been casting this as a fiction film, I would like to think I could have made this good a choice. To cast him not as a kind of lurch-like villain, but to cast him as a very charming fellow who has a very sort of keen intellect. I think the other aspect of Ferrari that was interesting to me, which we discovered after a bottle or two of Prosecco, which he generously offered us and the crew after the interview, was that Ferrari had felt he really hadn't gotten his due. He hadn't gotten his proper credit for Lance's success. And frankly, I think he deserves credit. You know, the fact is he was certainly very knowledgeable about the drugs that Lance was using and was very much a part of figuring out how much he was supposed to use, but he was also very much about training. So ironically, when we went there to speak to Dr. Ferrari, and this is at a moment before Lance's secret was exposed, there was an element of what Ferrari wanted out of the interview, which was to let people know just how much he had to do with Lance's success. Because a lot of people in America think that a guy named Chris Carmichael was Lance's trainer and the guy who was masterminding what he was doing in terms of preparing for these tours. The guy was always Michele Ferrari. Michele Ferrari was the one who masterminded Lance's success. The great mystery that hangs over the Lance Armstrong story, of course, is why was it that he never won anything prior to, let's say, 1998, when he came fourth in this other big race called the Vuelta, and then 99, when suddenly he starts winning these tours after a time when he had never been a good climber before. The question is why? Because we know he was doping back in 93, 94. And I think the theory that we posit here, or we suggest here, is that it was Dr. Ferrari coming up with a kind of key innovation, which was to suggest that Lance start pedaling in a higher gear, sort of spinning faster, which meant that he was not putting as much pressure on his muscles, but now putting more pressure on his heart and his lungs. And that, combined with drugs, really made a big difference, I think. At least that's my theory. Now, Lance, of course, completely denies that. He thinks it's all about his will, or he says it's all about his will, and it's just his determination to ride the tour. I think it's Ferrari coming up with that plan where the drugs were actually more effective because he had switched the load from the muscles to the heart and the lungs, where drugs like EPO or transfusions were going to be more effective.
In March 1999, Lance said, I got to go see Michele. I have to do some tests.
My relationship with Lance changed over time. I mean, I came onto this film through the good graces of Frank Marshall, who was friends with Lance, and Matt Tolmach, who knew him and had gone riding with him as a cyclist. Matt Tolmach was an executive at Sony and then ultimately became a producer of the picture.
I don't know about you, but I don't...
And so I tagged along for the ride. I was the filmmaker. My relationship with Lance deepened when he had to come clean. And oddly, there was a moment, maybe 4-6 weeks before Oprah, where I got a call from Lance. This was after the famous USADA report came out. And he called me and said, it's true. I doped. I lied to you. I'm sorry. And we began to discuss the possibility of him talking to me and making it right. That is to say, this time telling me the truth. For a while, it appeared that Lance was going to do that first in my film. That didn't happen. He had promised that and then reneged on that promise. He had panicked, I think, and then gone and it felt he needed to get back his fans more quickly, so he went on Oprah. But ultimately, over time, we developed a strange relationship where we would discuss what was right and wrong about what he had done. And when I say discuss, I don't mean on camera, I mean in phone calls and sometimes in face-to-face conversations. And through that process, we came to a reckoning about him sitting down again. It was an odd thing. I mean, yes, he had lied to me, and frankly, he had broken any number of promises to me, but it wasn't the first time I had been lied to. And frankly, I liked Lance on a kind of day-to-day level. But I could also be honest with him and say, this is what I think about your actions and how wrong I think they were. And we would actually have a candid conversation about that. So the relationship became more interesting. Now, Lance has stopped talking with me now, perhaps because he feels the film, doesn't show him in the light that he would like to be shown. I would find it surprising that he would be surprised, because I told him quite honestly that I was going to focus very intently on the lie, the Armstrong lie, and also his abuse of power, the way he went after people. He said in conversations that we would have, so long as you tell the truth, I'm okay with it. Well, we offered him an opportunity to see the film, at least as of this taping, and this taping is now taking place in late October 2013. Lance hasn't seen the film. We offered him an opportunity, and he sent his representatives and said. So ever since the moment I told him that the film was going to be called The Armstrong Lie, I haven't had any further conversation with Lance. I'd like to think that I could have that relationship, but at the end of the day, the more important relationship to me, to be honest, is the relationship I have with the audience. But I was very forthright with Lance about what I was doing, and so we'll see. We'll see what happens in the future. Ferrari's conviction would be overturned 2 years later.
At the end, I was absolved. Probably we need a movie to explain the whole story with Simeone.
My philosophy about doing interviews is sort of like the Columbo philosophy. There are a lot of interviewers who, when they interview people, are terribly impressive and demand to be seen and heard, asking the probing question, and also to put, to make the interview subject know that they're waiting there, to pounce on them at any second. I don't approach interviews like that. I approach interviews in a much softer way, just trying to get as much information as possible, and frankly, to allow interview subjects the space to say what they want to say as they want to say it. And I may guide, I may come back around, and sometimes I will ask questions to which I know the answer just to see how they will respond. But my questions are usually simple, sometimes seemingly simple-minded, and I often find that those questions elicit some of the best answers. When you ask very basic, simple questions, and sometimes ask people to describe things, you get something far more interesting than you would get by putting people off their game. I like to be the rumpled figure in the background, shuffling along in his trench coat like Columbo, who nods, pushes, prods, and gently guides the conversation to see what people will reveal. And they often, everybody likes to tell their story. And my job, I see it, is to let them tell the story the way they want to tell it. When I get back into the cutting room, then I can decide whether or not they've told me the truth and to contextualize it in other ways. But in terms of the interview process itself, my role is to be shy and diffident and to bring them out as much as I possibly can.
His perspective was, listen, this doping's been in place for 100 years in this sport.
The decision to look into the camera in 2009 using that device I called a Tonytron was terribly important because I wanted Lance to be different from all the other interview subjects, and I wanted him to look directly into the audience, in part because I understood even then his power as a public figure. So he was looking right into our eyes, and it was an interview of a difference. And I also shot him against a background because I wanted to be able to shoot that interview anywhere in the world, in any hotel suite or anywhere else, so it would feel like the same interview, so that it was he was, in a way, the kind of de facto narrator, even if undependable, of his own story. The other people, it was important to have them off camera to create a distinction in a way, and that was important to me. But when we came back to Lance in 2013, both in his house just after the Oprah interview and then later in this interview, which we shot in New York, I felt it was important to do something rather different. We were going to take the background away. Now he wasn't on stage anymore. He wasn't the politician anymore. Now it was purposefully more informal and off camera. So it wasn't the kind of teleprompter vibe. It wasn't the actor speaking directly to camera. In this case now, it was the two of us having a conversation, and that made much more sense in that context. That conversation ended up being very interesting for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons was a very simple one, which was after all these years of denials, I was able to ask Lance Armstrong to give me a kind of informal sketch of how things worked, like how did he do this handoff of drugs with Moto Man? How did, how many transfusions did he think he had to do it in this particular tour? Something very bizarre after all that time having been spent in 2009 where everything was part of this grand denial. Now it was just very matter of fact. Oh yeah, of course, we just pulled over to the side of the road and did a blood bag. So there was something I found very engaging about that. And I think a lot of people I think differ on how they see this interview. Some people are offended by it. Some people I think are intrigued and entranced by it because I think Lance is being very candid. But some people don't necessarily like what they hear. Now, this is an interesting moment. This is where you're seeing a kind of purposefully old footage of a transfusion. And I like that old footage because it makes it look rough and raw and not professional. And this is one of the staggering things about what these riders were doing is they were doing these transfusions in hotel rooms and in buses. But viewers, this is kind of like the Kuleshov experiment from the old days of the silent Russian cinema. Viewers tell me how powerful they think that moment is when they see the whole team transfusing blood bags in the bus. Well, the fact is we don't show that. What we do show is a shot of a bus, which you're about to see. But we've just showed somebody being transfused. So somehow there's a fusion that takes place in the mind of the viewer where you've seen that transfusion and then you know for a fact that in 2004, a bunch of Lance's teammates decided to pull over to the side of the road in a bus and just transfuse themselves with bags of blood. When you see the shot of the bus and the crowd around it and you hear George Hincapie talk about it, suddenly you think like you're seeing it, even though you haven't seen it. I found that very interesting. So this is Lance, again, talking about doing a transfusion and how much he should do. And he's talking very candidly, precisely about, how little it took and how pragmatic this process was. He's also now talking very openly about Ferrari, something he never would have done before. Absolutely never. Now, that's a classic Lance look. He's like rolling his eyes, like people just don't get it. They don't understand how it really worked. That's a very Lance moment, a real Lance moment, as opposed to Lance the politician moment.
Each year, the bar got nudged a little higher.
Having seen that, now this is the footage where we're beginning to riff off of Lance's interview to describe in further detail how some of the doping worked. And this is where we're coming up to that shot of the bus that I talked about earlier. Here we just show, people gathered around this bus. This is 2004, and we're talking about how they were doing these blood bags. But I think, well, you don't see anything except that what's going on inside the bus of these transfusions. And because you've seen that footage from before, a lot of people, are gobsmacked by this, and they're thinking they're seeing something that they're really not seeing. And this is a lovely shot, which we were able to do. We shot Lance so much throughout the year that we were able to use a lot of fun devices, a lot of fishing pole cameras, a lot of cameras on bikes. this and that. It was really an exciting opportunity to use some camera elements that normally on a lower budgeted documentary I never would have been able to use.
Life for me at the time was moving fast. Look at 2005. I had won 7 tours in a row. I was engaged to a beautiful rock star.
What's interesting about Lance in this interview is that he was able to contextualize what it was that he had done and said some things that were very honest, like this one. He thought he would never get caught. This was a sequence from the original film. You know, one of the things we were doing was following Lance around as he was coming back into the tour, and one of the things they tried to do was to, you know, examine his position on the bike, which they do in a wind tunnel, and sometimes they'll adjust the seat just a little bit higher, a little bit lower. And this was a kind of a technical aspect of the sport that I hadn't fully appreciated, you know, where you go and you analyze in great detail precisely how the wind is going to, you know, affect your performance and how you can adjust your body. Your body becomes part of a kind of machinery, which includes the bike, that ends up being something that, you know, is very carefully monitored. Ferrari himself felt that actually Lance was getting too technical, that he was twisting himself into pretzels by doing stuff that he shouldn't have done. He should have focused more on the kind of natural
I don't think so.
body position that made him feel good, rather than trying to focus too much or too intently on the wind resistance. Do you have any concern about going back and opening up? In this part of the interview, I think that a lot of people have asked me, was he lying to me in 2013? I think that for the most part he was honest, but I think there are some key moments where he wasn't. And I think there are key elements to Lance's story where he's still not willing to reckon with what it is that really happened. There'll always be a mystery hanging over it because there are some things he's adamant about. One of the things he's adamant about is that he did not dope in 2009. I came to a rather different conclusion. But that's part of the cinema that's going on here, is that we're cutting back and forth now between these two different interviews. And over time, I think in this film, you can really begin to see the difference between them. That's a tell, by the way, when he reaches up for his nose. Very often he goes for his nose or puts his hand up by his mouth. That's usually giving you some sense that he's about to tell a lie, or he's about to embellish something in a way that is to Lance's myth-making or storytelling advantage or potential. This sequence is a fascinating piece of footage that we also had in the original film. In the original film, it had a completely different meaning than I think it has in this film. In the original film, by this point in the movie, you had become so much a part of Lance's team and Lance's perspective that when he goes after this guy named Paul Kimmage, who is a cycling rider who had ridden the Tour de France 3 times, when he goes after him rather viciously and says, "You're not worth the chair you're sitting on," for a comment like that. In the first film, you're almost on Lance's side. I mean, you can see what a jerk he's being and how brutal he's being, but, you know, he's saying how outrageous you are for suggesting that I'm the cancer. And he uses the cancer card to really go after this guy. So in the first film, you're ambivalent because you think, well, maybe he shouldn't have made fun of Lance's cancer-fighting efforts. In the second film, you see much more of the brutality, much more of the mechanism, the actual process by which Lance would go after and marginalize his enemies. He'd almost always go on the attack. And by going on the attack, he would never have to defend himself. He always thought that offense made more sense than defense. And offense would always put people off guard. And then he'd just kind of move on. By attacking his critics, he scored great points constantly. In making a documentary, one of the things you grapple with is trying to tell a story out of materials that are disparate and inconvenient, sometimes very powerful and poignant, sometimes seemingly prosaic. But you're assembling them. You're creating a story out of real-life events. And so you constantly have to ask yourself whether or not you are going too far in that way, whether you're kind of making a myth, and yet at the same time you know that if you don't create a story as you would in a good movie, people aren't going to watch. It's that simple. So there's always that tension that you feel as a filmmaker when you're doing nonfiction. I have to make one comment about this section. You know, this is a wonderful section that was from the original film, which is much more about cycling. And we had used this Tom Waits song. I love this song, and I've used Tom Waits in many of my films. But it really speaks, I think, to not only Lance trying to take the long way home, but to the kind of suffering that the cyclist endures as part of their sport. And there's something, you know, every once in a while, I think in a film it's important that you just take time out to watch and to listen and just soak up the atmosphere in a way that's what cinema does, after all. If you could write it down on a piece of paper, there'd be no reason for a movie. You know, it's moments like this where you just sit back and watch and listen and absorb and take a meaning from that is essential, in the sense that you can't break it down in some kind of simple one-word description. Narratively, this was kind of a key moment, you know, going back to what I was saying before in terms of how to set up a story that has a kind of fictional logic to it, meaning not that it's false, but that it has that kind of narrative drive. It's, you know, what was it that Shaw once said, you know, if you put a pistol on a mantelpiece in Act 1, it better go off by Act 3. Well, Floyd Landis was our pistol on the mantelpiece. And we put him in here because you had to know that lurking in this 2009 comeback was danger for Lance. And the danger was Floyd Landis, who had been his teammate, who knew everything about Lance and everything about doping, but now is getting increasingly pissed off because he wanted to get back in, and Lance's team was basically saying, dude, you know, you're radioactive and we're the clean team now. So Floyd's resentment was building up. So structurally, we wanted to seed this moment because we wanted to give some sense for the viewer of impending doom that was coming down the pike. The whole Tour of California stuff was very much a part of the first film because it really gave you a sense of how popular Lance was. Look how deep the barriers are filled with people. He was so far beyond anything that was any other cyclist. He was just hugely important to people and so iconic that it was palpable. The cancer card was one we had to reckon hard with, you know, for the same reason that we put in the sequence about his suffering through cancer. We felt we had to reckon with the whole Livestrong idea. There were a lot of people who believed that Livestrong was simply a kind of convenient feint, a shield, a cynical way of masking his doping. You know, as I say in the film, I don't really believe that. You know, there's obviously an element of press agentry to this kind of thing where he's, you know, touring the kids' cancer ward. But we also know that he really did reach out to a lot of cancer survivors constantly in ways that were very palpable and very emotional. And, you know, I think there's a tendency with characters, and I've faced this in other films that I've done, there's a tendency with characters when some malfeasance has been discovered to automatically flip on a switch and pretend like, okay, that person's all bad now. I think that's a terrible mistake because that's kind of the monster vibe. In other words, if somebody does something wrong, then they're a bad person. The fact is, we're all capable of doing terrible things. You know, we try to keep our lives in balance. But the fact that somebody does some terrible things, the fact that somebody tells a big lie, doesn't mean that everything about their life is utterly false. You have to embrace the contradictions of everyday life. That's one of the things that I feel I've learned most about life, really, from being a documentarian. I'll never forget when I made my film about Enron, that when I investigated the backgrounds of some of the California traders, the Enron TRADER traders who shut down the California electrical grid, I discovered that they weren't monsters at all. I mean, these are the people who literally people putting people's lives at risk and laughing about it. But off the job, they were very generous people. So it's never so simple. And there's a huge part of that kind of psychology that I think is part of the Lance Armstrong story, which, I've dealt with in a number of the films I've done. And the police call it noble cause corruption. And actually this commercial is perfect timing to discuss that because, Lance, I think, felt he had a license to dope, or license to lie about it, because he was doing so much good. If you have a noble cause, then you can't possibly do bad. Or if you do bad, it's okay because you're a good guy, or you have a noble cause. Lance, after all, was doing so much good for people. Everybody loved his story. He was delivering for them. It was so important. So if he went after a few people, if he told a tremendous lie that snookered millions of cancer survivors around the world, that was okay because he had this higher goal. So it's a very interesting phenomenon, this noble cause corruption, and I slipped into that kind of investigation of that kind of psychology, but it's one that seems to be at the heart of a lot of my films, and the Lance Armstrong film is no exception.
Never be alone. So Dani, Yanni, and Chechu on the climb. You guys look for Lance, and if there's a problem, he needs guys to...
I didn't think I was making a film about noble cause corruption at all. I thought I was making a film about noble causes. and it was the undertow of the story that ended up catching me by surprise. That was really the shocker for me. Way behind all the top racers. His supporting riders slowed down. This is an interesting moment in the film because this is where Lance, I think, sees that he's not at his best. He's 38, he's weak. He doesn't have the power that he had before, and he's having to reckon with that. It's the first time you can just catch the tiniest glimpse here in this next interview where he looks off into the distance, and you can see he's actually worried, which you almost never see with Lance. Right there. He gulps. He's worried for the first time. You never see that with him. He's always supremely confident. And I think this is where he begins to start thinking, am I going to have to dope in order to win? Because we know for a fact that in that race, that Giro d'Italia, the Tour of Italy, he definitely wasn't doping by virtue of all his blood values. Even his most vigorous critics knew that. But that look in his eye, it's one of those little clues. Was he starting to think about, some extra boost that he needed to make? This scene was shot by one of the great camera people who I used in the film, a guy named Richard Pierce. Richard Pierce was not the chief cinematographer. That was Maurice Alberti. But Maurice wasn't available for this trip up to Aspen, and Dick shot it. And Dick is an extraordinary cameraman. He's also a director in his own right. He's directed fiction films and documentary films. But he is one of the great cinema verite camera people. He was one of the shooters at Woodstock, and he's, by all accounts, he was Martin Scorsese's favorite cameraman, because when everybody had fallen by the wayside, either because they were too stoned or too tired or too drunk, Dick was always rock solid. He always had a shot for Marty to go to when Marty was cutting Woodstock. Hi, Bella. And so, he just has a great instinct for how to follow the action in a cinema verite moment. This is a very intense scene. There's a lot of tension between Lance and the testers. There's tension between Lance and his kids. Should they be watching this? Lance, at the same time, obviously is, he reached out to us and said, look, the testers are here. You guys got to shoot this. There was a moment of tension where he insisted that we be allowed to shoot. So there's a lot of tension going on here. And Dick is filming this in a way that really both captures the record of the moment, but also all the emotional undercurrents going on. It's very rare to have, cinema verite camera people are very talented, and it's a rare talent to be able to see the drama in scenes and to know how to get at those key moments of drama while at the same time to cover a scene so that an editor can put it together, and also to give enough of a record of a scene to get context. And all the while you're having to worry about focus and where you're moving. It's really an extraordinary talent. And the best ones, like Dick Pierce, just do a fantastic job. This piece was not shot by Dick. This was shot by Mark Higgins, Lance's PR guy. good guy, who had a little flip cam and was there the next day. And then we were able to get this from Lance. And it's, this whole scene is very interesting because it both testifies to this narrative about doping in this story, but also, in a way, there is a sympathy here, I think, for the athlete, where you've got to be willing to be invaded by people who are examining you all the time to see whether or not it is that you're doping. Of course, Lance is, trying to make a case for it, even as he's allowing himself possible outs or possible ways of eluding doping. But there's something very powerful about seeing this and how doping investigators come into people's homes and do this. Here we can begin to see some of the camera work that we were able to get at, when we had all these resources. We were filming here at Lance's training ride, and this was Dick Pierce, and as well as Ben Bloodwell and some other folks. We just had a tremendous amount of hardware that we were able to use. This, I think, was shot on a pole cam, which gives it a steadiness that it otherwise wouldn't have. And we were able to go in quite close to the bike riders in ways that we otherwise wouldn't be able to do. So it gave us a tremendous amount of flexibility and options in the cutting room. For this film, I was present for most of the shooting. I shot on and off with Lance over the course of a year. And so I would dip in and out of his life. I wasn't there constantly, but for certain key moments, we were there and we'd spend 2 or 3 days with Lance, and then I would be there shooting it. When it came to the Tour de France, which we'll get to in a minute, I couldn't be there for every moment, and we had to plan much more strategically who would do what and when. And there were other moments when Lance was followed by a group called the Texas Crew, who had followed him a lot. If I couldn't be there, I would give them very specific instructions about the kind of thing that I would like covered and how. And that was important, to give the look a kind of consistency. The graphics in this film were done by a firm I worked with a lot called Big Star, and they always give, the graphics a nice kind of textural quality, and without ever losing a sense that you're kind of inside the documents themselves, which I've always found very important and powerful. This section of the film was important because we were trying to kind of prefigure what was going to happen in the tour. The tour took a much bigger role. The Tour de France 2009 took a much bigger role in the first film. But we were trying to seed little elements of mystery and foreboding over the tour. And it began to occur to me that perhaps, one of the things that I was seeing, even though I wasn't there for that moment, was the idea that he was training in altitude in preparation for the tour, and possibly, though I have no proof of it, but possibly he was then, once the altitude increases his red blood cell count, that he was transfusing perhaps a bag of blood. Because if he went into the tour thinking he was going to ride clean, but had an insurance plan, you can't decide late in the game that you're going to pull out that insurance plan. You have to have that insurance plan in place in advance. My theory is, even though Lance utterly denies this, my theory is that he had that insurance plan, that he wanted to ride clean, he intended to ride clean, but that training period in Aspen was his period during which he was going to give himself that bag or two of blood that he might need if he discovered that he couldn't ride clean. Now that's Chris Carmichael on the right.
Quite honestly, I think,
who was the guy who was allegedly Lance's trainer. And many people in America believe that he was Lance's trainer, the guy who was responsible for Lance's performance. It was Ferrari. It was definitely Ferrari. Now, this is a device that we also used in the first film, coming back to that key moment where we pull down the sound so that we start with this moment at the very beginning of the film and then come back to this. Now we've come up You know, it's like the whole thing has been a flashback now and sometimes a flash forward. Now we're coming up to this moment, which is the Tour de France. Why is he coming back? Is he going to make it when he does come back? Shooting the tour was a blast because we had a tremendous amount of resources. We had a total of 10 cameras. We had 2 cars, which would leapfrog across the tour. We had a camera in the car, which is this one that would always record Johan. And sometimes we even had cameras on the bikes. And when we would leapfrog, we would go to a place in the tour and we would set up 3 cameras that each took a different angle. The riders would go by, and then we would peel out and try to go past the riders again, and then set up in another place and do it. This piece of footage comes from the time trial, which is a single rider exercise. Very different than those stages of the tour where everybody was racing together. We weren't always with Lance, but we were with Lance enough and had convinced him that we had to have enough access to be able to watch him at key moments. I had a sense that he might be watching the other riders finishing after he had raced to see what had happened. I asked for permission to be there to do that, and he allowed it. So we were able to watch him. You can kind of see the expression on his face right there, where he's clearly not happy about the fact that so many people have now beat his time. He was gambling, I think, that it might rain because it was said that rain was going to come later in the day. He gambled and lost. If rain had come, then the times would have been slower. He might have come out on first. But that's not the way it worked out for Lance. Here you can get some sense of the scrum around the Lance bus, which was just extraordinary. It wasn't like that for all the other team buses, but for the Lance bus, the Astana bus, people were just jammed around it because, you know, he was that extraordinary celebrity. Now, we had great access. This is another key moment of access that we were allowed to get because Lance allowed us to hang out from time to time. And we were just hanging with him here while he was watching Contador from his hotel room. And it kind of gives you some sense of how Lance plays the game, which was terribly important. Here you get some sense of the breadth of the tour. And, you know, what we did to construct all the tour sequences was to have a combination of our own cameras, and then of course the tour had their own feed, their own kind of standard feed, which we were able to access after the fact and to intercut with the material that we took. Our shots were generally much more adventurous, impressionistic. You know, this was one of our shots. The shots of the tour generally are, you know, have much more to do with a record of the event, which is right and proper. But ours were always much more adventurous because we knew we had that tour coverage, so we could go for much more with our camera work. Here's one camera, which is in the back of the car shooting out. Now we have another camera, the one that's always on the coach, Johan. And this is kind of taken out of sequence. You know, before in the original film, this was from a stage much later on. We put it earlier here because it's really good, this stuff of explaining the role of the domestiques, these support riders. This is footage from a kind of a GoPro, which we attached to the bike of one of Lance's domestiques, Popovich. Popovich, you know, was a great rider, but technically, I'm not even sure technically, just as a rule, it's forbidden to put a camera on a rider's bike in the Tour de France. But we didn't ask permission. We were prepared to beg for forgiveness if they caught us. They never did. And so we just did it. And we got some of the more unique perspectives of the tour from those cameras. We had one pointing forward and we had one pointing back. And the one pointing back gave you a perspective that you can't get from any other moto camera, because there are a lot of motorcycles who are following the cyclists throughout the tour. And that is from inside the group of riders known as the peloton, because the motorcyclists never get inside that group that you can see there. No motorcyclist would ever penetrate that group. But by having a camera pointing backwards from underneath the saddle or the seat, you know, you can see or feel what it's like to be inside that peloton.
I better move up.
The crosswinds caused a split in the peloton. The whole film was shot on HD. We originally shot it on the EX7, a Sony camera, which had a great deal of versatility because it allowed us to put any kind of lens on the camera, but it was also a pretty good and nicely well-balanced cinema verite camera, so it worked very well in the field for all sorts of purposes, and we needed that kind of flexibility with that many cameras. So it was a great camera.
Just like I would do in the old days, you know? When we was on the same team.
I just remember Lance being all fired up that he was in the first group and, you know, asking us to go harder. And we're like, dude, we're doing our own thing here. Sure, you're here, but, you know, we're not really doing this for you.
They could be putting Lance Armstrong in yellow in the next 24 hours. A little bit further back down the road, this is Alberto Contador. He got caught out, but he's keeping at the front end of the main field. But I wonder what he's thinking about the presence of Lance Armstrong in that little group.
French radio was out of this is a betrayal.
Betrayal?
It's like, why is he... When it came to the Tour de France, there was an issue because the Tour de France organization, the ASO, the group that runs the Tour de France, has a view that they own that event. And so if you're there doing more than news coverage, if you're making a movie, if you're making a documentary, you have to come to an agreement with them and pay them some kind of access fee, which we did in fact do. And that access fee included not only the footage that we shot, but also footage that we would get from their feed and indeed, you know, footage from past tours. So it was expensive. I'm not sure what news cameras do. I think news crews, you know, get a kind of press pass, and they have the license to shoot a certain amount of stuff for news purposes. But when you're talking about an extensive coverage of the race that's ending up in a documentary, you actually have to pay the organization that runs the Tour de France.
4 years later, why not? I'd totally take it.
When I started this film, I didn't know anything about cycling, and I had a tremendous learning curve. And that was something I talked to a lot of journalists about it. I read a ton of books. And it was over the course of a year. Thank God I had a year to get ready for the Tour de France because I would begin to see how the races worked. I would talk to other riders about, you know, what they were expecting, what they were after. And I would see the strategy in races, you know, as the year went on. And it was a tremendously heavy learning curve.
On Lance.
I thought it was odd that...
Oddly, the producers, Frank Marshall and Matt Tolmack, liked the fact that I didn't know that much about cycling because they figured, as I had done with some of the other films, like I didn't know that much about accounting when I started the Enron film. I certainly didn't know that much about torture when I started Taxi to the Dark Side. They figured I'd learn. And as I learned, I would be able to communicate how the sport worked better than somebody who was so expert in it they took a lot for granted. And I think in a way they were probably right.
All this is hard. Such a huge number of people wanted to believe.
This whole section of the film has a lot to do with the first film and the second film. The fact is, in the first film, I wanted to get a perspective that was different from Lance's perspective. We were inside the bubble. We had great access to Lance, but I wanted outsiders, critics, to weigh in. But because I had such great access, everybody assumed that I was part of the promo job. I was part of the Armstrong Lie. And so they wouldn't talk to me. Quick aside here for cycling fans, the guy that Johan Brunel is talking to is a guy named Bjarne Riis. Everyone at the Tour was playing angles. Greg LeMond, the former Tour winner. Getting back to this issue of chatting with people, everybody treated me with tremendous suspicion. Here's a crew that was hired by Greg LeMond to follow me, in part, to expose what I was doing. But I found it tremendously frustrating, because people might have seen my other films and known that they were investigative and known that I wasn't, really going to do a promo job. But nevertheless, I believe that for whatever reason, they just refused to talk to me, which was very difficult to abide. But ultimately, by the time we got around to the second film, a number of people did come forward and talk to me.
Another one was to control who had access to him.
This whole section of the film right in here is one of my favorite sections because it involves a lot of of the reason I put myself in the film. This understanding of how Lance decided to make his old teammate Frankie Andrea the only guy to be able to interview him. The kind of slyness and the sardonic humor with which he did that, I was present for that just when I was riding in the car. And a lot of filmmakers maybe might not have put that detail in if they decided to keep themselves out. By putting myself in, I could relate things that I had seen, even if the camera wasn't necessarily there. So that was, it was terribly important, because this is a whole discussion of a kind of a grand theater that's going on here, where Lance is bringing Frankie back, and he's making him the only guy that can interview him, which is both a way of kind of punishing Frankie, because now Lance has to, Frankie has to come crawling to Lance. It's a way of rewarding Frankie and saying, I can welcome you back. But, for Frankie, it must have been weird too. And Frankie, frankly, when he saw us filming him, would pull his hat way down over his head. He didn't want to be shot. I think he felt embarrassed about what was going on here, because all of this backstory, and now we can see these deposition tapes that, we were able to obtain from the organization that was trying to claw back its money from Lance. You began to understand a sort of deeper story behind the image. A lot of what this film is about is image and reality. It's kind of pulling back the veil to see what's really going on. And you'll see a moment where two people, Frankie and Lance, are smiling at each other during the Tour de France, and they're kind of acting parts. Frankie as the devil-may-care interview subject, and Lance as the jolly celebrity yucking it up for a brief soundbite. But behind is all this dark history about Frankie and his wife Betsy, having given evidence about how they had heard Lance admit that he had doped. So the whole film is about how a lie hides in plain sight, and the mechanisms that Lance would use to make that lie feel true to everybody. And this is one of the most extraordinary performances of Lance. I mean, he's just absolutely brutal in terms of wrapping himself in the mantle of cancer survivors and others. There's his tell. You see him going up by the nose. And at the same time, viciously going after his critics with absolutely no sense of doubt. He's just moving forward. Win, lose, live, die.
And don't think for a second. I don't understand that.
In pondering who was hurt by the Armstrong lie, one has to look first to the cancer survivors who believed so fervently that Lance was clean, and that had become so much a part of their story, their belief system. Hope rides again. So I think it's terribly disappointing when you believe in something and have faith in somebody that's so fervent, then you're told that that faith is not founded. I mean, in some way it shouldn't have mattered, but because Lance made it matter, people were so deeply disappointed and hurt when it was revealed that, in fact, Lance had doped. The other people who were hurt, clearly, were the critics, the people who were trying to tell the truth. And Lance, through the force of the power of his personality, through his money, through the help of his sponsors, through the help of the cycling organization, went after those people and went after them hard. Sometimes he sued them, sometimes he just vilified them, and sometimes he would just mention something to somebody else, like, I'm not sure if Frankie's so good for cycling. And the next thing you knew, Frankie wasn't getting a job. And then he would go off in public on these people, as he's doing in this scene on The View, where if you're Betsy Andreu and you know you've told the truth, and you're watching all these people gather around Lance and say, oh gosh, yes, Lance, you're right. You're so great, and people like Betsy who were criticizing you were so awful. It must have been a torturous moment psychologically to know that you're telling the truth, and yet everybody else in the world believes a lie. She took Lance's side.
Were you ever in a hospital?
This is, of course, central to this key moment of the film, where you have a woman who really did a lot to defend Lance by denying the hotel room incident. and then in a voicemail message left on Betsy Andreo's machine, lashes out at Betsy for trying to rain on the parade, for trying to stop the gravy train. I think this whole incident is sort of testifies to the darker side of what happens when lies get told and people need to defend those lies for reasons that may seem pure at the time but aren't so pure after the fact.
I was a liar as long as the people close
Betsy Andreu is a key person in this documentary. Now, I had talked to Betsy Andreu. She was one of the few people who in 2009, who was a critic of Lance's, who agreed to talk to me. And we had many long conversations on the phone. And it took a long time for me to get her trust. But we talked a lot on the phone and off the record during the making of the 2009 film. So I was learning a lot about what was going on from Betsy. But I didn't put her in the 2009 film because I felt that, my brief, the goal of that film was to do the comeback story, to follow that year. I could put Frankie in that film because Frankie, was covering Lance during that 2009 year, and that was a way I had of moving back and forth between then the present and the past. But Betsy, I didn't feel fit in that film, but she became a critical presence in this second film because this is a woman who really was deeply offended that Lance was calling her a liar. In her view, nothing was more important than being a truth teller. And so the idea that Lance would call her a liar was deeply offensive. And she made it her mission to try to tell the real story about what was going on with the Armstrong Lie. And for a long time, she was marginalized. But, like a kind of Norma Ray character or an Erin Brockovich character, at the end of the day, she won out. Emma O'Reilly was a woman in a different context I might have liked to have talked to, but I wanted to keep the focus onto a small number of characters. And Betsy and Frankie seemed key to that effort. One of the most interesting things about the Armstrong Lie is that really it was an open secret that Lance had doped. I think, when the USADA report first came out, there was this sense that, oh my God, we've now penetrated the secret of a few people who work together, in dark corners to, hide this secret from everybody else. The fact was, the whole Peloton knew that Lance was doping. Hundreds of people knew, because they were doping too, in part. And also, a lot of the critics knew. So what was amazing about it was that this whole, this whole lie was really hiding in plain sight. That was the staggering thing about this. This was this character, David Walsh, in a way, was kind of the Van Helsing to Lance Armstrong's Dracula. He saw it as his job to put the stake in Lance Armstrong's heart. And now there's another movie, a fiction movie being made about his story. But I think that, Walsh really was one of the first key people on the scene to do that, to raise questions about Lance Armstrong publicly, to challenge the omerta, the code of silence that was in cycling.
Those riders, and they would say, listen, you're flying a little too close to the sun. We're going to be watching you. You better stop what you're doing.
There were dozens, if not hundreds, of those conversations going, hey, this is close. But the truth is that everybody was making money.
The UCI's head, this guy Han Verbruggen, he was in charge of promoting the sport. This gets at the heart of one of the things that troubles not only cycling, but I think a lot of professional sports, where the very people who are in charge of promoting the sport are also in charge of policing it. And when you have an athlete that's bringing so much power and so much money and so much fame to a sport, it's very hard to countenance the idea that you would run that person out on a rail if they fail a doping test. So it's almost one of those things where even if it wasn't explicit, there was a kind of implicit understanding that
there was controversies every year.
We didn't want Armstrong to ever be caught.
Big ones.
Verbruggen asked an acquaintance, Emil Vrijman, to conduct an investigation into the newspaper allegations.
In the conversation with Hein Verbruggen, clearly was the focus point on saying, find out what kind of research did they do.
You know, this was an interesting element for me, the so-called Vrijman report, which was a report that was made to address Le Mensonge Armstrong, the article in the French newspaper L'Equipe about whether or not Lance had in fact doped in 1999. One of the things that Lance told me on the telephone while we were talking and before I finally finished the film was that in fact he had paid for the final bill of the Vrijman report, which I found a kind of a staggering fact. I didn't say so explicitly in the film, but what I did do was to, you know, because it seemed, of course, Lance's credibility at this point was somewhat impugned. But what I did do was to give a sense that there was something about the report that was not quite right, and there were a series of payments that were rather odd. You know, particularly, you know, the idea that Lance Armstrong would give $100,000 to the UCI for a blood testing machine that had actually been purchased a few years. Kind of a staggering idea that they would come up with a cover story that seems so utterly implausible. But that is, in fact, what they did. I think in years ahead, when all the legal cases are settled, we may finally understand, and that's something that I'm looking forward to finding out about in the future. Of silence among writers about doping.
Durante il tour del 2004.
Now this section is in fact about omerta, about the code of silence. One of the interesting things about the code of silence is that you basically had a bunch of riders who were making money off of cycling, and they were more entertaining if they doped because they could ride longer and they could ride faster. And so nobody wanted to rain on that parade. And so if you had somebody like this guy Simeone, who was criticizing Lance's Dr. Ferrari, there was a sense that he was the outlier. He was the problem, not the fact that the whole sport was rife with doping. So that was also very much a part of the culture of cycling. This section was in the first film too, because I felt in the first film even, we needed to show something that testified to Lance's cruelty. And there's two key moments here, this smile, and then also, you know, that zip of the lips, and also a moment in just a second where Lance says, I was just following his wheel, and he smiles again. It's that smile that almost has a razor's edge to it. You really sense that cruelty. This comes back to this moment of kabuki. You know, having seen all this history, one of the great things that Andy Grieve and I were able to finally put together in the structure was then to go back to this kind of kabuki. So now you see this interview, which looks very anodyne, very innocent, very sort of straightforward, and you realize there's this huge amount of subtext going on underneath it, which, once you understand it, you just get a sense of how lies are constructed and how they're defended in plain sight. One of the things about the tour is there's a huge circus that surrounds the Tour de France, which was really fun to photograph and really fun to be a part of. You know, people, it's this staggering event that people have so much fun at, just hanging out for hours and hours, getting horribly drunk, waiting for the cyclists to come by in a second and then packing up their camper and moving on to the next stage. Here's that popo cam that I talked about earlier, which is actually now pointing back from the saddle. Maryse Alberti, something should be said about Maryse, the wonderful cameraman who's worked with me on a number of, camera woman, I should say, or a camera person, who's worked with me on a number of films, going back to Enron. She just has an exquisite eye. And of course, it was a benefit on this particular film that she is French. So we were going back to her homeland. And she has a great sense of how to shoot verite, but also an exquisite eye. So both for the images that she herself shot and for the way that she worked with the rest of the shooters, and after all, we had up to 10 cameras on this shoot, you know, we really were able to capture a kind of a style and to go after shots aggressively that gives some sense of sweep and scope to this event. You know, because part of getting into this film and part of telling the story of this film was not only to tell the story of doping and the story of the lie, but to understand how the cover-up worked for so long, you have to understand the engagement of the fan. And that was another reason we decided to have me be a character in the film, because I ended up rooting for Lance. To understand how that rooting process works, you have to understand the sport and how beautiful it is. And so it was terribly important that we get the sport right, because you can't really understand the lie until you understand the need for the fan to believe against all evidence, you know, that's presented forcefully right in front of your face, that your hero is in fact a hero, not someone with feet of clay. I'm counting on you for the movie. I didn't have constant access to Lance, but I did, you know, have access to him from time to time, just hanging out in his room and asking him things. And those moments were important and special. And he's quite natural and quite a charismatic character in a way that is I think, palpable and gives the film a certain inner tension. You know, if you think of Lance now as a kind of a villain because he lied, nevertheless, he's a very charming one and a very charismatic one. And I think that makes this a more powerful movie for that reason.
We have 2 weeks of racing behind us.
This stage was terribly important to the original film because this was the showdown stage between one of the key backbones of that first film, which was the rivalry between Lance Armstrong and Alberto Contador, seen here, who was Lance's teammate on Astana and who had won the Tour previously. And Lance was the old man coming back. He was coming back to Astana only because Johan was there. So suddenly you had 2 captains. And so this stage was tremendously important. In the other film, we had given a backstory to Lance where he had stared down somebody in the past, a rider named Jan Ulrich. He was known as the Look, where he looked back at that rider and then just decimated him on the field. This then had a little bit more meaning when Contador looked back at Lance, his look, and then he takes off, just absolutely humiliating Lance in the biggest day of the Tour, where you can just see him blasting off. One of the fun things about making films is picking music, and I was trying long and hard to find the right piece of music for this moment. I love Manu Chao, and I found this one song called El Viento, which just repeats over and over and over again, the road, the road, the road, with this kind of reggae beat that gets faster and faster and faster as the pace of the race gets faster. I was just gobsmacked as Tim Squires did an extraordinary job. This was in the original film of putting this together. But when I was just at home on my computer, kind of playing songs against footage, and I picked this one out and started playing it, I thought, wow, this is perfect. It was just, this is again one of those great moments where you can just let the music play and watch the race, and that's all you need to do. And then put a scene like this in the hands of a great editor like Tim Squires and just revel. There's one of the few shots that I actually took. They would give me a camera. I'm not the world's greatest cameraman, but from time to time, just to get an extra angle, I would be in a certain location. That was one of the few shots. One of the things that's actually kind of staggering when I think about this film is that it took a tremendous amount of time to process all this footage and to cut it together, cut the first film together. By the time we got to the second film, it really had to be done in a hurry in order to be able to make it make sense at a certain moment in time when all this activity was swirling around Lance. And yet the structure had to be far more complicated than the structure of the first one. So it was really, it's really a fantastic testament to Andy Grieve that he was able to take the first film, which was pretty good, I think, even though it would not have stood the test of time after Lance had confessed to doping. But to take that film and completely repurpose it after we had gone in and done all these new interviews. The new interviews themselves were still tough to get. I think there was still a great deal of distrust. In fact, Travis Tigert, the head of USADA, never agreed to be interviewed by us, which, I was very disappointed by. I think he felt that somehow I was tainted by my association with Lance, which I never really understood. I think he may regret it now. But Travis Tigert didn't agree. There were a number of other cyclists who didn't agree. And it wasn't easy, even after the fact, even after Lance, had revealed that he had doped, to go and get people who had refused to talk to me before, like Jonathan Vaughters, to come clean and to talk to me this time, but they finally did. This moment for me is maybe one of the lowest points of my career as an interviewer. I can't even ask a question. I keep stumbling and stuttering, and Lance kind of fills the gaps and said, "I'm sorry, I fucked up your documentary." And then he apologizes, which, really is a moment where I think he was quite sincere. Because I know that night, for example, he apologized to a whole bunch of his supporters who had expected him to come back and win. And he had so often, delivered this kind of fairy tale ending for people that he was really, truly sorry. And that was another aspect of the kind of myth-making machinery which I found affecting, that Lance had shouldered this responsibility. Yes, he was telling a lie. Yes, he was doping. Yes, he had gone after people brutally, but also he felt, I think that was part of that noble cause corruption, he felt that part of his noble cause was to deliver this fairy tale ending for people, and he shouldered that responsibility and felt very serious about it. Johan knew that Lance was not at his best. So by this stage, we were really firing on all cylinders in terms of our ability to shoot the race. We had never shot this event before. And like I said, we would have to kind of leapfrog. We had 2 cars. You'd leapfrog to a position. You'd set up 3 cameras, 3 different angles. The riders would go by, and then you'd jump in your car and go around the race to another point. And you had to figure out every day, every morning, we'd have to figure out where we would put our cameras at what point in the race. By this stage, it was fairly late in the race, we kind of had it down. We knew where a lot of the action was going to be. And as a result, we ended up capturing key moments with all sorts of different cameras, our telephoto camera, our in-car camera, our moto camera, a couple of us working handheld cameras. We had it working on all cylinders. One of the things I love about the tour is it's the one cycling event, it's the one sporting event in the world in which there's seemingly no barriers to the fans. They're all streaming out onto the road. You could see Contador in earlier scenes beating people back, even here with Armstrong. People running ahead. It's hard to imagine like a running back in the NFL sprinting toward the end zone and 10 or 12 drunk fans run alongside him as he tries to score 6 points for the team. But in the tour, that's exactly what happens. It's an amazing event for that reason. Chance to get back in the game. By following Contador's attack, the Schleck brothers were now second. There's a lot of debate about what this has done to cycling. Lance himself feels that the way this whole thing has been prosecuted is just to cast cycling in the worst kind of light. I think cycling feels that by vilifying Lance, they'll isolate the problem, and thereby everybody will imagine that now that Lance is gone, the sport is clean. I think the doping scandals have really cast a pall over cycling, which is too bad because it's such an extraordinary sport. But I think really cycling and really other professional sports won't really move forward and solve this problem unless they really confront their own responsibility, that is to say the organizing bodies, their own responsibility for how and why doping is allowed to happen. I think it will always happen to some extent, but as long as you have organizations that are in charge of promoting the sport, in charge of policing them, you're not gonna solve that problem. In years past, Lance had never won. We think a lot about the whole doping issue here and whether or not, if everybody was doping, there was a level playing field. I think there was not a level playing field in the sense that Lance had a power that other cyclists didn't, and I think that power allowed him to elude authorities in ways that other people weren't able to do. But at the same time, you know, people have brought up certain issues relating to both doping and cycling, and also this aspect of trying to just figure out ways to make the human body go as far and as fast and as hard as it possibly can. You know, taking you back to the idea of Michele Ferrari. In some ways, you have to kind of admire how that worked. It may not have been fair, but just understanding the idea of a human being fine-tuning the physiology of other human beings in order to make them go farther, faster, longer. There's something intriguing about that, and I must say very seductive. And yet at the same time, it brings you back to the essential element of any sport, which is every sport has to have rules. And when you and if a sport doesn't have rules, it becomes chaos or anarchy. And the hardest problem of all is doubt. That's the problem of doping. We like to believe in our heroes who are able to transcend their limits to extraordinary performances, but then if we're in that mode of doubt, we wonder whether it's them or it's the drugs, and it's not that satisfying. And yet, in another way, we're to blame because we keep demanding these larger-than-life performances out of these athletes. This was a kind of a key moment for the film, which was the moment where I have to explain how I lost all objectivity, and over the course of the tour, I was just pure and simple rooting for Lance. I'd become convinced by that moment in time that Lance was riding clean. He was now 38 years old, and so somehow this performance on Mont Ventoux, which was probably his best day of the tour, was magnificent. Even the French at the time thought it was magnificent. You know, L'Equipe, the newspaper that had published the Armstrong Lie, said, hats off to the Texan.
That's not going to happen. I'm going to get third.
By putting myself in the film, I could, out myself as a fan and thereby show how the whole process works from the inside out. Because as fans, we need that rush. We need to live vicariously through athletes, and we want to believe in the purest way that this is a kind of fairy tale possibility. Sad to say, it doesn't end up being as pure as we would like. And this is the key moment in the film where I have to reckon with the idea that this was the perfect ending for the old film. This was the perfect ending. The storybook ending in a way that I had been searching for in doing this film in the first place, the idea that I would do something more inspirational. And then, sadly, here comes the doubt, the notion that everything that I thought about the race was likely not true. And this is the part of the lie that Armstrong won't cop to. He is adamant that he did not dope in 2009. There's no way to prove that he did definitively, but all signs certainly point to it. And that gets to the heart of this whole issue of when you're interviewing people, and particularly for me when I'm interviewing Lance. I think a lot of what he told me in that late 2013 interview was absolutely true, even if it wasn't always comfortable for people. But this is one part of the story that I just did not believe. There is a logic to it. Lance has a point. There is a clear-headed argument, but there's all sorts of other details having to do with his blood levels that really don't square with this. And so it becomes very hard, both for this film and even as I think to my role as an interviewer in other films, to know just when it is that people are leveling with you, and if they ever are.
Swears to me that he didn't.
I don't normally go to what I would call a French place, this idea that reality is all subjective. I do believe in an objective truth. But you see what storytellers we all are and how we all shade our stories in order to be able to make them more palpable to what we need and what we want and what we believe. So, in a way, this film is about telling stories and the stories that we need to hear in order to go to work every morning.
My name, I'm going to prove that I'm doing it clean. It's like
my documentary influences have been pretty diverse, and I would count myself as one of those people that doesn't have a style that I imprint, obsessively on every story. I kind of feel that form should follow function, that the style of any particular film depends on that story, that can change. Nevertheless, there are some filmmakers that I've learned an awful lot from. I remember Night and Fog being a very powerful influence on me, because that's the shortest but possibly the best film of all on the Holocaust. But one of the things that makes it is not only the imagery, but also a very poetic narration that puts the lie to the idea that narration doesn't make sense in films. I think maybe voice of God narration is not at all powerful and is a kind of legacy from a master narrative era. But the idea of pointed, poetic, or personal narration, I think, is terribly important. I've learned a lot from Errol Morris, both, particularly that film that made such an impression on everybody, The Thin Blue Line, not only because of the recreations, and there are no recreations in this film, but I have used them elsewhere, but also in a kind of rigorous search for the truth and what is real and what is not, what is a story, what is a fictional story, and what is the true story. And in that film, Errol Morris, only purposely didn't show a recreation of the story he actually believed, which I found a very good idea of logic for a film, that you have rules for films and you abide by them because they help the viewer, but those rules can change. But the idea of the rigor of certain rules, there's no objective set of rules, but there should be the rules for an author. Marcel Ophuls was a big influence on me, and one of the great things he said early on was, I always have a point of view. The trick is showing how hard it was to come to that point of view, which is something I've always tried to be guided by. And, there are other filmmakers. I was a big fan of a film, oddly, of a film called Sherman's March, which was very much a kind of a first-person film. I don't think I could have ever made that film, but in thinking about trying to put myself into the story, I thought a lot, oddly, of Sherman's March and Ross McElwee. It was a very brave film because he shows his own weaknesses as he's kind of narrating through the story. So, the documentary form is a tremendously exciting one because it's so elastic. And the choices you can make are so tremendous and so creative. In a way, they go way beyond what you can do in many fiction films, which sometimes feel straitjacketed compared to the kind of exuberant formal experimentation you can do in a documentary, which sometimes doesn't even look or feel like formal experimentation because you're dealing with the stuff of real life. But in terms of the structure of the story, in terms of the way the narrative moves, in terms of the way another first-person master, I think, is Werner Herzog. I always loved that film, Grizzly Man, which just seemed a masterpiece of taking footage, again, not unlike the Armstrong Lie, but taking footage that was there and seeing it in a different context, knowing about something that's happened, notably that Timothy Treadwell is dead. So, one of the things that's so exciting about the last, 15, 20 years in documentary is that it's become this tremendously vigorous petri dish where all sorts of wild bacteria emerge. I know that's a pitiful metaphor taken off the top of my head, but there's something about the idea that anything's possible in a documentary that is so terribly exciting.
You get 6 months.
One thing I should mention in talking about the making of this film is the score. David Kahn, who's a wonderful record producer, is also a great composer and has composed the music for a number of my films. He's also, a cyclist, not a pro cyclist in any way, shape, or form, but he likes to ride his bike a lot. And so he really got turned on by this film. And I think he just did an exquisite job because the whole soundscape of the film, from film 1 to film 2, had to change radically. The soundscape of film 1 was more of a rock and roll score that was kind of edgy. It was kind of taking Lance's point of view. The score for the second film was much more mysterious, much more haunting. And it was not taking Lance's point of view at all, just the opposite. It was as if it was acting as a counterpoint to what Lance was saying, digging deeper into the mystery, urging the audience to look behind the image. As the hands are thrust upward, the chords are darker, they're more minor key. So it was a very haunting and kind of deeply psychological score, as opposed to the first one, which is sort of edgy and seat riding. So David, I think, did a wonderful job.
But I know what it took, and my teammates know what it took.
One piece I wish I could have put into the film, which we didn't get into, was there was a famous section in the Oprah Winfrey interview where Lance was talking about calling up Betsy and apologizing to her. And he said, and he recounted his conversation to her about how he didn't call her fat. He said he was a lot of things, but I never called you fat. He's saying that, of course, while, he's being interviewed by Oprah Winfrey. And it was one of the most awkward moments of the interview. It testified to the fact that Lance will probably never be a headliner at the Comedy Store. But also, oddly, what was interesting about it, and talking about it to Betsy, in her relating that conversation, she found that terribly funny in her sardonic way. And that was a private joke between the two of them, but it just felt like a thud as Lance tried to, it seemed like the crudest, most sexist comment he could have possibly have made, and it went all wrong on Oprah Winfrey, which testified in a kind of a smaller way to how badly the whole Oprah Winfrey thing went for Lance.
I hope you do the right thing.
The final part of the film really testifies to the whole idea of what is knowable and unknowable, and what do we forget, what do we remember, how do we want our stories to be told in the future, and what do we forget on purpose, what do we allow to recede into the recesses of our memory. And there's an idea that everything rolls around the hospital room. And the hospital room itself takes on this grand metaphorical dimension that's terribly important, another mystery inside the mystery. The inability to really reckon with that moment and come clean becomes terribly powerful. And I think the other thing that's important, as we roll into the end of the film, in the midst of all these mysteries, there had to be a way of myself resolving my own character arc in a way. Most of my films, I almost never say precisely what it is that I think, because I think ambiguity and mystery is important in films. And after all, one of the things that films can do that articles can't is to show that kind of human drama, and hopefully show it in ways that can't be boiled down to a sentence or two. And if they could, why would you make a movie about it? So I'm reluctant to impose too narrow a point of view in a film by saying, this is what I think about this scene and this is what this scene means. But in this film, I felt it was important. Lance had lied to me. He had lied straight to my face. I had gone back to him and listened to his story again. It's a story about trust. It's a story about doubt. And it's a story about being fooled. So at the end of the day, I had to make sense of all of that in my mind. And so there's a brief period where I just lay it out and I say what it is precisely that I think. And it comes at a moment right after Lance says, that he wasn't a cheat. That is to say, he looked up the definition of the word cheat and he realized that it was to get an unfair advantage on a rival or a foe. And then I lay out what I think cheat means, and I say precisely what it is that I think about this whole story, which I almost never do. But I thought in this case, it was terribly important, because it was as if I had to interview myself and really come to grips with what it is that I thought.
did not feel that you were cheating.
One of the odd parts about this whole experience was that I actually got back on a bike again. I felt it was important, you know, if I was going to understand what a cyclist did, to actually get a bike, a good bike, a Trek as it turned out, and to start to ride, even with a heart monitor. Now, my riding was absolutely pathetic, but it really did give me an appreciation for what it is that these riders do, as I struggled to get up fast on some of the very tiny little hills around my neighborhood in Summit, New Jersey. I really did get a new appreciation, or a profound appreciation for the kind of pain and skill and endurance that these athletes reckon with. It really is inspiring. The story was a bestseller for Lance, too. It made him a fortune of over $125 million. At the end of the day, there's a whole aspect to this film, which was, how do we end it? And do we allow Lance to have the last word? In a way, I felt that it was only fair that we do that. And the last word came with a piece of film from that interview that we shot right after Oprah. What's revealing about this moment, I think, is that Lance is pointing out, I think, a rather cruel irony, which is that he's been erased from the history books, which as a historian I think is absolutely reprehensible. That's just bad history. Maybe you could draw a line through his name, but erasing him is wrong. And frankly, I do think that he was the best rider of a dirty era. But by Lance saying that at the end and cleaving to it, it's as if he's missed the whole larger perspective of the meaning of his story. And that his athletic achievement, which is one way of expressing himself, writ large in a greater context, doesn't mean as much as the human morality tale at the heart of this story. People have asked me, do people still dope in cycling? And I think the answer is undoubtedly yes. I don't think that doping will ever disappear from cycling or any professional sports. But I think there's far less of it now than there ever was. The testing is much better. And I think, whenever there's a big bust, and you'd have to look at the Lance episode as a bust, doping does decrease. There's a fear factor, just as there was after the Festina affair. But I think there is an understanding and an ethic in cycling and an attempt to keep it more clean. The question is, whether or not all of us as fans can continue to insist on mechanisms to hold riders to account, or whether we'll fall prey to our own need for such extraordinary performances that in an odd way will provoke athletes to continue to dope in the future.